Okay, now that we've got our wrist cross in, we will start working on the arm. Set some stuff aside here. Okay, so we're going to go back to this set of wooden pieces here. Now, we're going to kind of build this in a few pre-assemblies and then put the whole thing together. So the first thing I think we'll work on is going to be the servos for the wrist pivot. So you're going to need this piece and this little triangle piece that goes with it. So we're going to get those parts out and set the rest aside. Now, as with all of our wooden parts, depending on the quality of the part and how you want it to look, you may want to spend a little time sanding out all these parts, taking out any burn marks or anything that you don't like, getting them a little smooth. I have already pre-sanded these parts mostly for speed, so we're not going to worry too much about the sanding, but the usual, sand them to your own liking. Okay, so the part we have right here is going to be an assembly that is going to hold the two servos that drive the wrist pivot. So we need those two parts, and then you're going to find you're going to need the two small servos that were in your kit. These should have been in the box, just two separate servos like this. And those are the parts we need now. So let's start by getting out our servos. And first thing we're going to do is just pull the servos themselves. We'll leave the hardware be for now. I'll show you how to deal with that in a minute. So we're going to pull out our two servos. Get them unwound and have them ready to go. Now, you're also going to need the square nuts and screws and washers that hold these assemblies together. And let's see, you know what? We're going to find those, depending on how your kit was made, they're either going to be in with the parts you've already opened if it was a hand kit, but if it's a full display kit with the base, you'll find a large package of those screws in with this base. So we're going to need to get those out. Now, this is enough screws to build all of the arm plus the base, so make sure you don't lose any of them. And we'll go ahead and just slit the corner of them, because right now we only need a couple. So we need two square nuts, two button head screws, and two washers to build this little assembly we're working on. And I like to go ahead and put these two pieces together before mounting the servos. It makes it easier for fighting with these square nuts because they tend to get a little bit tough to get to when they're inside with the servos. So basically, take a look at your part. We've talked about the clean side. I tend to take the clean side and leave it pointing out. It makes these be tapered so they're easier together, so we're just going to slide it together. When we get to these parts, they're pretty loose. It doesn't really matter which way they go together, just as long as they're together, it's not critical. And so how we put this stuff together is these square nuts, you'll see we have these little square slots. It's pretty, you know, it's pretty simple concept. The little square nut slides in the slot, and I tend to go ahead and put the two in there right now. Makes it a little easier. You got to balance it so you don't lose them all. And then I tend to just slide this first part on. And then what I like to do is I actually just set my washers on the top here, because I only have two hands, and get those kind of close to where I want to be. And then I'll bring in my screws and drop them through the hole. Now what you want to do is go ahead and just kind of finger tighten these screws in until they catch those nuts. And once you get a couple of threads in there where they won't fall out, then you can pick it up and hold it. We need to find a Allen wrench that fits our 632s, which we've had before. And so what I tend to do is, you'll notice there's enough slop in here that that nut can kind of stick out one side or the other of the plywood. What I like to do is I just grab the nut between my fingers and I kind of hold it centered. And then I just kind of snug down the screw. And I'll tend to snug everything down to, you know, just slightly snug, make sure it's all where I want it before I go ahead and tighten it down. And again, don't have to tighten this stuff crazy. It's just snugging it up. The wood gives, so if you just keep tightening, you'll just keep crushing the wood and eventually something will break. So just get it nice and snug. And that'll create a little cross section like that. So from there, we're going to go ahead and set the servos in. So what we're going to do with the servos is you're going to go ahead and from this side, which is basically the front of this little bracket, you're going to pass your wire in, your servo in, and just kind of rock it in place and drop it in like that. So servo spline up, on this side of the bracket. So what we're going to need though is we're going to need the screws to put that in. So let's get those out. So your hardware bag you'll find has all your links and some more of the posts and all your screws. But what you're looking for there's some 832s in there. They're a bigger screw, the biggest screw we've used yet. So I'm going to dump everything out. And what you're going to find is in here, the 832s are these big button heads. Now, you'll find a couple that are pretty long, and then you'll find 8 that are short. We want the shorter ones. The longer ones go for the base. So if you do not have these long ones, it means you're building just an arm and not a display kit. You might not have those. So what we want to do is we want to separate out the 8 short 832 button heads. 2, 4, 6, 8. And then along with those, you need what they are is the nuts. Now these are what are called a small pattern nut. So they're a very slim little nut, so they fit in there. So you're going to find 8 of those. There's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you'll find you have a couple of extra of those because they fit the other screws for the base. 2, 4, 6, 8. Those guys. Okay, and then I'm just going to slide the rest of this hardware over to the side here until we need it later, so we don't get confused. Okay, and so for the 832s, it's pretty simple. We're going to bring the screw in through the servo from the front, through the bracket to the back, and then put on a nut. So we're going to do it for one side and then the other side. So let me take care of that. Okay, so we got our 2 servos mounted in there. Again, servo wires facing up, mounted on that side. So what we're going to do next is we got to go ahead and mount on our servo horns, because this assembly needs the horns on it before it gets put into the arm. So now we're going to go over to our bags from our servos came in, and we're going to open those guys up. And basically you've got quite a bit of stuff in here. You can throw most of this in a drawer, because you're only using a couple of pieces, but always hang on to the rest for fun. Okay, so out of here, you're basically going to need the large flat servo arm. So it's the longest one in there, double-sided, it's got some little ribs on it, give it some strength. That's the arm we're going to be using. And then you're going to find a tiny little black sheet metal or wood type screw, and that's the one that holds the horn on. So those are the 2 pieces. The rest of this stuff can go away for a later date because we do not use it right now. So we will not be using it in this kit at all. These are just extra parts now. Okay, so there's one. And pull that and see if I can find this little screw. And the screw. Throw all that in there. Okay, servo arms, servo horn screws. Now, these arms need to have one side trimmed off. As far as I can tell from looking at them, the 2 sides of the servo horn are identical, so it really doesn't matter which side you trim off, but one has to be trimmed off. And what I like to do is I just get myself some cutters. A little bigger than this might be nice. These are a little bit tough because they're not quite big enough, but they get the job done for me. So what I'll do is, if you look at the top of the servo horn, you can see there's kind of this raised ring that goes around where the servo screw goes into. I kind of like to cut my horn just outside that ring and kind of use that ring as a guide for rounding out the back of the horn. So as a start, I just take and snip it first, and I leave a little bit of room, and it's a hard squeeze. And be careful, when you snip this, this part goes flying. There we go. So I'll do one snip, and that takes off most of it, and then I'll come back and do a couple more snips to kind of work everything fairly close. Now that's pretty rough on that side now. So what I'll do after that is you can sand it. Now one thing that works pretty good is if you got yourself a coarse nail file, you can kind of take that nail file and round out the other side of that. And you can, with a little bit of time, you can clean it up pretty good. Now, I have a belt sander and all those fun tools like that. So I went ahead and prepped a pair of these all ready to go already. So I'm going to set these ones aside and blam, look at that. Beautifully rounded, sanded, buffed, ready to go. So we've got a pair of those horns cut down to one side. Now, what we still need to do is we still need to open up one hole in the horn to accept a 440 screw. Now if you go back to your screw pile and you look, you'll find these little long 440 button heads. That's the size hole we need to put in the end of this servo horn to get that screw to go through there. So one option is, like we've done before, we can just take our X-Acto knife, we're going to do it to the very last hole, and we're going to stick it in there and spin it. Do it from one side, do it from the other side, go back and forth until you get the hole opened up just to fit the screw. Again, I have a few extra tools. I got a drill bit and a drill, so I'm going to make it the quick way. So I'm just going to drill my holes in here first. Makes quick work. Alright. And that is done. Alright, and now you'll see that that 440 screw will fit through there, and that'll be for later when we put the link on. Put that 440 back there. Okay, so one thing that we have to do is we have to position these horns correctly right off when we put them on here. And once they're on and on to the robot arm, they cannot be repositioned easily. So we really got to make sure we get this right. So the way I like to start is I just stick one horn on. Now, when the servo's in its center position, it needs to be facing outward. Each horn needs to be facing. So what you can do is you can snap one on there and you can just lightly rotate it till it stops, and then the other way till it stops. And you'll notice it rotates about 180 degrees. So what we want to do is just keep adjusting our servo horn until when we rotate it, it stops pointing up and it stops pointing down. So I can see that I need to bring my servo horn around one notch, maybe two. Let's try that. So pointing mostly up, pointing down, pointing up. I think that's about as good as we're going to get it. You can only get so good because of the way the notches are. Yeah, that goes further past this way and further past that way. So I will tend to have it go right here. So again, stops. You can see it's a slightly past vertical and it stops pointing straight down. So that one's good. I like that one. We're going to do the same on this side. Up, down. So that was a good shot right on the first try there. So, and we need to be, you know, pretty close with this. There is some tuning of the servo center in the software, so we can tune that a little bit later once we get to the software, but we want to keep it in the right range. So once those horns are on and we like them, we're then going to go ahead and just insert the servo horn screws. Now be careful on these things. You are screwing these screws into plastic splines, so if you crank them down too hard, you will strip out the spline in there, and then that's a bear. So just put them in there, snug them down. Okay, and that completes our basically wrist driver kit. Now, these wires right here, you'll see you can basically, I like to smooth them out, I bend them over, and where they're going to go is they're going to go down right next to the servo, back down towards the bottom on each side. So you see that? You make some, I like to leave just a little bit of a service loop there so they're not pulled too tightly. And they come down, and what they're going to do is, there's two notches cut in the block, in the piece right next to the servos. Those are going to get tucked into those notches later when we go to bolt this onto the arm. They're going to be tucked in there. And so what that does is it lets those servo wires lead out and go to the into the back of the arm with the rest of the wires without taking a chance of pinching them. So you want to make sure. So we'll make sure those are in place when we bolt this on. But for now, that's where we want to be. Okay, so that is one of our pre-assemblies. We'll set that over here to get ready. Now, the next piece we're going to do is we'll go ahead and start with the upper arm. So what we're going to need is these three pieces.